power on.
Sega Genesis does
16-bit arcade graphics.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does
16-bit sports action.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis does.
Man of Tomorrow here with you. Of course, my voice is still not at 100%, but you know, I'll tell you, one of the worst things that can happen to a podcaster is when their voice goes, especially when, your podcasting pays the bills, as it were. Man, well, I have a request. Actually, it was kind of a funny request. The person's like, "Oh, didn't you say you were going to do a Sega Genesis top 8 games?" It's like, or maybe maybe I just imagined that. And of course, it was their funny way of, suggesting that I do one. And look, I'm here for you, the members, the patrons of the Zomia ONE Underground. You have content you want me to do? Let me know, and I'm more than willing to do these kinds of episodes. I think some of the best underground content has come from ideas from Zomia ONE Underground members, from people other than me. One of my favorite actual top 8s that I did, and I love doing these top 8s. But one of my favorites was one that actually my, man I love, my brother, Robin Freebeard, he suggested it was something like the shows that only went one season. And the top 8 shows that only went one season, and maybe they should have gone a lot further or whatever. But that was so much fun to do. I mean, what a great thought experiment and everything. And just getting into that, because there's a ton of shows that I love that really did only get one season, sadly. But that one, you can look back in the catalog for that. That was a great time. And you want to hear some, you're going to hear some deep cuts when I talk about, when I covered those shows. So the Sega Genesis, now this is worthwhile talking at this point, and in fact, so this question got asked of me, I want to say a couple weeks ago, and so I made my list, and the only reason I didn't record this sooner was because, well, my voice went. But the funny thing is that not but a couple days after I made my list, one of the games on here that I felt like would have been a really deep cut, and I could screenshot you when I made that list. I mean, you can see it. You can see the date on it and everything. Well, one of the deeper cuts on this list actually is going to end up being now on the Sega Genesis Mini, which we didn't know until they had their big announcement just a few days ago, where they added on 10 more games. And I have to admit, for a second, when I saw this, and we still have 10 games to go, because they're going to put 40 games on it. We know 30 now, as of the day that this is getting recorded, and this is getting recorded on, this is May 21st? Yeah, May 21st, 2019. We still have 10 more games to go, but for a second, when they released that next round of 10 games that are going to be on it, I almost said, oh yeah, you know what, I'll pre-order this. I mean, it doesn't come out until September, so plenty of time to make up your mind. And fortunately, you really can pre-order it, unlike with Nintendo's micro consoles, which I guess that's the technical term for these now, is micro consoles. Instead of just retro consoles, now it's micro consoles. Okay. I can dig that. Especially when you think like the Intellivision Amico and so on, because that's more than just a retro console, right? Just like I would argue that the C64 Mini is much more than a retro console. So micro consoles, sure. anyway, I got tempted to pick one up. And I mean, there's some funny business around it. Like a lot of people are talking about how is it not 8-bit do? Fuck. Anyway, I am 8-bit. I've bought from them before. I bought like the R-Type collection from them for Super Nintendo, and I've picked up stuff from them. Anyway, they come out with controllers and everything. They recently did the re-release of the Genesis and Saturn controllers that were officially licensed by Sega. Not that always means much, right? Because Sega did deals with @Games, and fucking @Games sucks. But regardless, the Genesis Mini, we know, is going to come with a 3-button controller, but some of the games, especially now out of that 10, the new list of 10, some of those games require 6 buttons. Now there's like a trick you can do where you can press like A and B and it can emulate some of the other 3 buttons. I don't know. It gets weird. But basically now, and I'm pretty sure it's I Am 8-bit. Now, they're coming out, or maybe it's Retrobit. I think that's the name of the company. It's Retrobit, not I Am 8-bit. There's so many of these different, and I love them. I think they're all great. But now, like, they're even positioning it as, okay, these are the controllers to get to play and it's officially licensed by Sega, supported by Sega, and it will work with the Genesis Mini, no problem. And it's just a USB port, so, I suppose you could plug in anything you already have. And it should work well for you. But these are the official 6-button controllers for the Genesis Mini. They'll work with anything else too, because it's a USB, connection. But at the same time, they're positioning that, and that's kind of ugly business on the part of, on the part of Sega, I guess. But yeah, so for a second I was tempted because one of the deep cuts on this list, and I'll mention which one it is when we get to it, really makes this worthwhile, and I'll explain why as we get into this list. So, but I'm going to do a top 8 games, and not some of these might surprise, some of them won't surprise at all. Some of them will be like, well, of course that's on the list. I'll put it out right out front. The Sega Genesis is in many ways the system that Sonic made, or the system that made Sonic. That conversation can go both ways. There are no Sonic games on this list. I love Sonic. I fucking love Sonic the Hedgehog. I don't know how the fuck I feel about that movie, but I love the character, okay? So, but that said, yeah, those are just so easy. You can easily say Sonic and Knuckles, and go with that. But I actually think, so here's the thing, is that if I were to include Sonic games on a top 8 list, I would include them on either the Game Gear list or on the Sega Master System list, which the Genesis was the successor to the Sega Master System. I think Sonic 1 and especially Sonic 2 on the Sega Master System and Game Gear, they're the same games, I think are actually superior platformers to technical platformers, not like speed platformers, right? Like they are on Genesis. Technical platformers to the Sonic games on Genesis. So I actually like 8-bit Sonic more than I like 16-bit Sonic, if that makes sense. I'm not being like hipster in that. Just if you've never played them, try them out. You can get them like on Virtual Console and the 3DS or something, or of course you can emulate them. And fuck, do I wish that they'd come out with like a Master System Mini. There are some great games on the Sega Master System. That would be a worthwhile top 8 to do as well. But you let me know what you think if you want to hear that. Regardless, so speaking of the Master System, there you go. Just so you know why there aren't any Sonic games on here. But speaking of the Master System, so the Master System did not do as well as certainly Sega was hoping, at least in the United States. So come 1989, now granted originally in 88 is when the Sega Mega Drive for the rest of the world would get released in Japan. In 1989, we'd finally get the Sega Genesis, their 16-bit console, the competitor to, well, yeah, let's get into that. But, their answer to what Nintendo was doing in North America. And then in 1990, they would release it in Europe. Okay? So, the funny thing is that the Genesis, the Sega Genesis, actually wasn't meant to compete with the Super Nintendo. It was originally designed to compete with the NES or the NES. And, I mean, this is common confusion. In fact, if it weren't for the Genesis in Japan back in 88, of course, I mean, understand, the Super Nintendo didn't come out in Japan until 1990, and other territories a little bit later, okay? The Super Nintendo was a response to the 16-bit era of gaming, which itself, and I mean, that was being spearheaded not by Nintendo, but by Sega and NEC. Of course, NEC with their PC Engine or TurboGrafx 16, etc. Okay, but both of those systems, Sega and NEC, were competing with the NES. They were not competing with the next generation that Nintendo was going to come out with. In fact, ironically, you could say this is an argument for market competition, whatever, okay? Ironically, the Super Nintendo probably would have never been created if it weren't for the growing success, even though it took a little while, but for the growing success of the other companies' 16-bit consoles. Nintendo was in no hurry to, they have the Famicom, the NES, they're dominating the video game landscape in the year 1988 and in 1989. I mean, they really still are. But they're starting to see sales slip, and so they're like, okay, fine, we're going to develop a new console. But Nintendo was really, they were just ducky with, the NES and the Famicom and whatever, doing its thing for, hell, they probably would have let it go another 5-10 years. I'm not kidding. They really would have. And I think it's, when you look at some of the later games for the NES, when you look at like Chrysalis or Battletoads or Mega Man 6, I mean, those games were pushing the limits of what the NES hardware could do, certainly. But at the same time, those limits were pretty fucking awesome. I mean, they were really, really great. But a lot of people, will look back and ask the question, like, why was the Super Nintendo, why did it just seem and feel so superior to its peers? And that's because really it didn't have any peers. The Super Nintendo was a 16-bit console. It was actually really more than that. But it was a console that was, breaking out on its own, not even really looking, I mean, you could say, because it was a response to the Genesis and to TurboGrafx 16 or, whatever NEC was doing. Yes, but it was really just operating on its own terms. And that was always Nintendo's mentality up until probably the past few years. I would say, no, it's been their mentality, I think, for quite a while, which is why they still flubbed and would release something like the Wii U. I mean, the Wii was a massive success, arguably the greatest success in video game history. Debates go on that between the Wii and the PlayStation 2. But you have to understand Nintendo's thinking, especially at the time. Their thinking, really from the NES or from the NES up, their thinking is, okay, you might buy another system, you might buy Sega's latest system, you might buy a PlayStation, you might buy this, but you're always, you might buy those, but you're always going to buy the new Nintendo system. So they kind of imagine themselves as just, they're not even competing with anybody. They are in their own realm. They're in their own world, their own reality, and everybody comes along for that ride. And then maybe they buy, someone else's system. And look, I mean, to say that Nintendo dominates in certain markets, I mean, it's an absolute truth. Look at the handheld area. I mean, yeah, I don't know many people who just bought a Vita. I know plenty of people that bought a DS and a Vita, or a 3DS and a Vita, or would buy a PSP and a DS, etc. But in the handheld market, I mean, they've always dominated, no matter who tried. And boy, for a good decade, people were trying to take down, I mean, you think of the Nokia N-Gage, I mean, you go down the fucking list of these shit show, handhelds. But Nintendo just didn't care, and they didn't even act like any of these things ever existed. They didn't care about the Atari Lynx. They didn't care about the Game Gear. Even though technically, as in technology, these were all, they might have been systems that had a few tricks up their sleeves that made them superior to the Game Boy. Nintendo didn't pay any attention to that. Now, they were paying attention again when their sales started to slip a little bit, and they said, okay, well, why don't we come up with something new? And so they come out with the Super Nintendo. But this isn't an episode about Nintendo. This is just to bring up the point that Genesis games, if you play them today, they don't come off as, they don't hold up necessarily as well with the beauty and grandeur that, except for maybe one game that's actually on my top 8 list here, that you see with the Super Nintendo, especially if you got the SNES Classic, in the past year or so. You see how these games somehow still look so good today, and that's because the Super Nintendo was a peerless system. The PlayStation was kind of a peerless, well, anyway, that's getting into a whole other conversation, but the Super Nintendo was a peerless system, and, it perfected what it was doing. And what people think are its competitors weren't really its competitors. Again, the Genesis, you go down the list of all these other systems, they were competing with the NES, not the SNES. So keep that in mind, that, if you wonder why some of these games, like, wow, I thought these are, no wonder that Nintendo won, because these games don't look as good. Again, they weren't competing with the Super Nintendo. So, but the Genesis had, I was a big fan of the Genesis at the time. It had its own charms. It had its own attitude. What it lacked in perhaps technical prowess and some brilliance in games, perhaps. There were some brilliant games still for the Genesis. But regardless, what it lacked in all of that, it had in just badassery, in just pure attitude. Okay, like there's the classic ad. In fact, I might even put it at the beginning of this episode where it's like, Genesis does what Nintendo can. That whole thing. My voice is horrible, so I have every excuse to go ahead and sing, because now I can say, well, no, I'm not a bad singer. It's just because my voice fucking is out. But anyway, so, Genesis just had all that fucking attitude, right? And whether or not the games actually lived up to that, the marketing was certainly selling Genesis consoles in America. Like, it was really, really working. And so, a lot of people were kind of, if they could afford it, instead of being a part of the console war between Genesis and the Super Nintendo, they would just buy both, and Genesis would try to compete with the Super Nintendo later on by doing Sega CD and 32X. I'm not going to cover either of those add-ons in this top 8. Those deserve their own top 8s, frankly, even though with the 32X, that might be a little bit of a challenge. But Sega CD certainly has a top 8 to go down. And a beautiful one at that. We could just start off with Night Trap. But anyway, we'll save that for another time. So, but this top 8, I think covers some games that maybe you never played, or games where no matter what any other console was doing, Genesis came up with something just beyond brilliant, and something that, regardless of technical prowess, it's a game that just stands out from anything else the competition was doing. So that's a big part of what makes my list, in all of this. So, another thing that I think a lot of people don't realize, that badass attitude with the Genesis. They went ahead and let on some very violent games, like, Mortal Kombat, which was the biggest game release of the 90s, of its day. It really was. This is a huge fucking deal. It's well known that the Super Nintendo, to release Mortal Kombat on the Nintendo, they removed certain fatalities from characters, okay, where they made it a little less grotesque, a little less violent, perhaps. They took out the blood, as to where the Genesis left all of that in. And a lot of people, even though Mortal Kombat, the first one especially, on the Genesis didn't look nearly as good as it did on the Super Nintendo, people still wanted and praised the Genesis version because, well, shit, it's got all the gore intact. Ironically, the Genesis, because of that attitude, would lead to the creation, ultimately, of the ESRB, which is where you get your, rated T for teen, rated MA, or rated M, or whatever, where you get these game ratings for different ages. Now, Sega actually created what was called the Video Game Rating Council at this time, to try and mitigate, let them keep that badass attitude, but mitigate parents' concerns around these games. And the Video Game Rating Council will eventually become the ESRB. So this came at a price, and, one could argue that Sega really, real trendsetters. Yeah, they were trendsetters for creating a fucking rating system. And that's something really to knock, in my opinion, to knock points off of the Genesis for. But whatever. It's important to note that, And eventually Sega would require, all of their games, like for the Genesis and so on, to get labeled with all of these things. I don't know the video game council or rating council ratings for any of these games, and I don't really care. And today, considering like that the average kid plays, GTA or Call of Duty anyway, does it really fucking matter? No. So none of that's going to end up coming up in this. But I do think it's an interesting historical footnote. So anyway, I think I'm going to start off there. This isn't exactly a ranking of like number 1 is the best, number 8 is the worst. These are all great games. Maybe my favorite game, I will put it number 1, but yeah, I mean, well, let's say this is a favorites. Okay. We'll go ahead and say that. So, but all of these are great. There's nothing, if they're in the top 8, that means they're fucking awesome. So just, you don't have to pay that much attention to the numbering. But let's start off with number 8. This might not surprise people much. But this is Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. Woo! I don't know that anybody else would put this on their top 8. I understand that not everybody thinks the Genesis port of this is the best game ever, because there's also an arcade port that Sega did. There was also one for the Master System. But I think the Genesis game, I thought that this was, well, Michael Jackson at the time was still white hot. No pun intended there. I'm a huge Michael Jackson fan, so I'm sure as fuck not making fun of him. This is kind of based loosely off of parts of the movie, Michael Jackson's Moonwalker, which is a very interesting film, to say the least. The game is, I like it. I like, the dance aspects of it. The music and all this different stuff really, really works. This is not the only time that Michael Jackson's music would make an appearance in a Genesis game. And real quick, I'll give you a little bit of trivia here. I've talked about this in the past, but Sonic the Hedgehog 3, the soundtrack for that was actually done by Michael Jackson. He's not really credited for it, but you can hear, like, the end credits music is actually Stranger in Moscow, which you can hear off the second disc of History. All of that, it's Michael Jackson. And nobody knew that up until recently. I mean, you could kind of tell, but somebody really did the yeoman's work of putting that all together. And fuck, yeah, it's Michael Jackson. So anyway, Michael Jackson's music does pretty well on the Genesis. But Michael Jackson's Moonwalker, it's a little bit different. And Michael Jackson, actually had a hand in these games and what these games were allowed to do. Like, we talked about how they created the Video Game Rating Council for concerns around violence. This is one where Michael Jackson's like, well, do we have to make it so violent? And I think it was really cool to, when you could get creators, for example, when Harlan Ellison, rest in peace, when Harlan Ellison was involved in the creation of the game based off the PC game based off of his short story, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, like, he had some really brilliant ideas to implement into that game, and it's still a great game. And I think this is true for Michael Jackson's Moonwalker as well. It really, really stands up. And actually, it's kind of funny. I mean, Michael Jackson would have a long history in Sega consoles, right? Like, he has a guest appearance in Space Channel 5, Part 1 and 2. He's actually in Ready to Rumble Boxing Round 2, right? He's the king of pop and everything, which I think is pretty interesting. But overall, this was considered, its reviews at the time were, well, frankly, I mean, they're pretty positive. Some magazines have even put it in their top 100 Genesis games of all time, which that's impressive considering there's almost like 1,000, not even counting homebrew. There's almost 1,000 some odd games for the Sega Genesis. So if you're in the top 100, you're doing pretty good. But yeah, check this out if you never have. And it's fun even just to hear like the Genesis version of a lot of Michael Jackson hits, shall we say. So I think it's a very worthwhile game, and very unique, and it's one where it actually, I feel like it worked, as to where you think about Shaq Fu and a lot of other games that would take a, some kind of pop star, or, popular figure and put it into a game. That didn't always work very well. But with Michael Jackson, it happened. And I think part of his, part of his feedback with the game, I think, is really what made that happen. So anyway, let's go on to number 7. And this is another interesting one where, trying to get away from some of the like, okay, let's just, punch the guy or kill the guy or, kill the enemy or whatever. This game got away from that in a very real way, a very interesting way. And this is a game that is just beautiful to just play and just explore. And that is Echo the Dolphin. I want to give you years on these. Michael Jackson's Moonwalker was 1990, basically a launch title almost for the Genesis in North America. Echo the Dolphin came out in 1992. Echo the Dolphin would spawn a huge series of games. In fact, one of its later entries, the one that came out for the Dreamcast and then the special edition version that would come out for the PS2, would be in my top 20 games of all time. But Echo the Dolphin is this beautiful game about a dolphin. Literally, you are a dolphin, and his name is Echo, and you have to more or less save the universe. And you end up, in the ocean on Earth. You end up doing so on spaceships. I mean, there's some time travel involved. I mean, it's really a wild game. And you would think, how the hell could this be an exciting game playing as a fucking dolphin? Try it. Just try it. It is beautiful. The music is stunning. The graphics at the time, I thought were so charming. They instantly hook you in when you play this game. And the gameplay, again, is thinking so out of the box to what I think a lot of people were used to at the time, where you're used to, okay, yeah, you're a tank, or you're a helicopter, or you're a jet fighter, or you're a guy running around, or hell, maybe you're even Sonic the Hedgehog, whatever. All of that still kind of works and gives you, I mean, because we're talking about the era of two-dimensional gaming, 3D gaming hadn't exactly been a thing yet. It was out there, vector graphics, things like this. But it wasn't exactly there yet. But this is a game that I think required a completely different way of thinking, even though it's still two-dimensional, but a completely different way of thinking it added on some degree of three-dimensional element to it, just in the way you had to think about how to play this game. I think this is an absolutely revolutionary game for a lot of reasons, especially at the time, and an amazing, because, you could say it's kind of cute. And if you want to buy into that way of thinking, I just think it's cool. But they outdid, in my opinion, Sega with Echo the Dolphin. They outdid Nintendo's own strategy, Nintendo's own mindset of creating cute and not killing so much. And I think they did it with aplomb. I think Echo the Dolphin, it gets well received and it gets well remembered to this day. And again, it became a series for a reason. But at the same time, I really feel it stands alone. It's a very unique series, and I don't think it gets enough credit. I don't hear enough people talk about Echo the Dolphin, including its later entries in the series. It is just a brilliant, brilliant fucking game. So Echo the Dolphin, number 7, we'll go with that. Number 6, exact antithesis of all of this. Number 6 is considered arguably not just one of the greatest games on the Sega Genesis, but one of the greatest games of all time. By the way, except for Michael Jackson's Moonwalker, so far all of these games are actually, or have been, and will be on the Genesis Mini. But Streets of Rage 2, this game, now there's other entries in this series, and you could argue that maybe technically in some ways that they have gotten better or that they could do more, but more doesn't always mean better. This game introduces a couple new characters into the Streets of Rage series, and the main winner here with this game, and what a lot of people remember, is Yuzo Koshiro's soundtrack for this game, because the soundtrack for this game is one of the first I can really think of where you don't have to be a video game fan to want to pop in a CD of that and everybody can get down to it, and everybody can enjoy it. It is, it's incredible. The music for this is wild, way ahead of its time, way ahead of its time. You're getting, synth, you're getting, a lot of electronic music. It's a dance soundtrack in many ways, and it's fantastic, and it just keeps the action pumping. And even though it's, kind of a basic, beat 'em up going through, it's not that basic. Even though it's kind of a beat 'em up going through, it just has so many great, late 80s and 90s stylings to it, that, and with that soundtrack included, it's a winner. It's a winner right out. And I mean, just tons of fun. And, you get multiplayer involved. Everybody's there playing together, and you're in for a great time. This also came out in 1992. And, I mean, 92 was a year, certainly, where the Genesis was really owning some ass and taking notice, and was probably more at the height of the console war between Genesis and Super Nintendo. And I'll tell you, Streets of Rage 2 was a big part, I think, of getting a lot of people picking up, Genesis consoles and setting them down and moving the Super Nintendo off to the side. Streets of Rage 2 is that great of a game. It still holds up that well. It was one of the first games that Sega ported to a 3D version onto the 3DS. I mean, it's just widely regarded as one of the best games ever made. Again, I mean, it's simple. You're going through the streets, you're doing your beat 'em up stuff. It's not particularly gory or anything, but, if you want to talk about violent, yeah, it's a beat 'em up. But just loads and loads of fun. The more people you add in, I mean, the more, you get a couple people there and you're just having a great time. And the style of it, honestly, I think it's fucking sexy. I think it's a sexy ass game. And I don't always say that about video games. In fact, this might be one of the first games or one of the earliest games that I would dare say is sexy as hell. I mean, it is right there. So yeah, Streets of Rage 2, easy pick. No top of lists of Genesis games would really be complete without this one. You could leave Sonic games out. You can't leave out Streets of Rage 2. It's a milestone in gaming. It really is. It's just for that soundtrack alone. But the gameplay itself is just so much fun, so tight. The controls feel so good. Anyway, all right, we'll move on to number 5. So number 5, this is the game, speaking of being included on the Genesis Mini, this is the game that was a bit of a deep cut to get included on the Genesis Mini. A weird one. And I'm kind of surprised Capcom allowed for this. And I included it. Now, I need to make something clear. I never played this on a Genesis. Okay, I only played this on emulators, and there's a reason I only played this on emulators, because it was never released on a cartridge. Key phrase there. It was never, or key statement, it was never released on a cartridge in North America. It was released on Sega Channel, which was the cable network that you could play Sega games on. And that's now in Japan and Europe, you could play it there on a cartridge, and you could buy it. But in America, you didn't have that. You didn't have that option. So this is one that I would play many years later on an emulator on my PC. And I mean, it's just like, I don't know. It's like finding the Holy Grail when you finally play it, if you're in North America and if you were a Mega Man fan, which I'm a huge Mega Man fan. So this is Mega Man The Wily Wars, which came out in 1994, very close to the end of the Genesis life, which is when compilations often get released for a console. Or, I mean, it either happens at the end of the life of a console, or it happens when it's like really, really popular and people just want to throw whatever games they can at a very popular console. And Mega Man The Wily Wars is really just a 16-bit remake of the first 3 Mega Man games, which for most people are considered to be the greatest Mega Man games ever made. Mega Man 2 especially. I would argue Mega Man 3 is actually the best Mega Man game ever made. But regardless of that, they're all here, so you don't have to choose which one you want to buy. You can just get all 3. This is the game that almost tempted me to say, yeah, you know what? And because it has Streets of Rage 2 on it, and because they included Vector Man and all these other things, yeah, maybe I'll get a Genesis Mini. But I thought about it a little longer, and I'm not going to do it. Basically because emulation for the Genesis is so solid on just about any other platform. I don't know. And because of the little controller fiasco, like, it just doesn't make enough sense for me. I'll play Mega Man The Wily Wars on an emulator, honestly. That's how I feel about it. So, but it is a nice historical oddity to include on that system. The remakes, so you have better graphics, right? These are literally 16-bit remakes of the first 3 Mega Man games. It does fix a lot of issues that were like little bugs and everything that were in the original 3 Mega Man games for the NES. But it does introduce some new ones. There are little sound flubs and things that happen there. I doubt they're going to get fixed on Genesis Mini. But I think this is really the premier way to play those 3 games Sadly, the Wily Wars is not included on the Mega Man collections that Capcom has been putting out recently. And that's a shame, because I would have loved to have played them. Like, if they put it out for Volume 1 or something, I think that would have been really cool. But it didn't end up happening. So this is one of the ways for North American gamers to play this for the first time. I mean, yeah, you can emulate it. I think there were like maybe an At Games console that had come out, retro console that had come out that included it in North America. But, you know, this is a nice oddity to have out there. But this is the one that I love this game. I included it on my list before I knew it was going to be on the Genesis Mini. And I just thought it was an odd moment of synchronicity that, oh shit, actually this is going to be on the Genesis Mini. It's a deep cut. It's a weird title to put on there. But it makes sense to do it, and I think it's a great inclusion. And really, this brings up the Genesis to over 40 games now, because this is technically 3 games in one. Yeah, if you've never played these games in 16-bit, I mean, it does have a different flavor. And it's fun. It's interesting. And without some of those glitches, especially like within Mega Man 3, nice improvement. I really think this is the way to play these games. So this might be a selling point for you on the Genesis Mini, or hell, maybe you'll just emulate it. But yeah, so number 5, Mega Man The Wily Wars. Great collection. I mean, and great bang for your buck, especially at the time if you could buy the cartridge. I mean, really. So let's go to number 4. Speaking of buying this cartridge, this game, I think, is the most expensive game that that ever was released for the Genesis. And the game is, and it's my favorite in the series, that is Phantasy Star 4. Phantasy Star 4 is, well, I don't want to get into a whole history. There's far better YouTube videos that you can watch about the Phantasy Star series. This is really Sega's Final Fantasy. Like that's really what we have here. You know, turn-based combat, you know, RPG, going through like a quasi science fiction / fantasy realm and all this. I love the Phantasy Star series, and Phantasy Star 4 was really a great swan song for the original Phantasy Star series. This game was so huge at the time. They had to release a special, like, expanded cartridge, effectively, a cartridge with expanded abilities. Something that Nintendo, of course, would do with the SNES many times, or at least a couple times, with, say, Star Fox with the FX chip, right? So, Phantasy Star 4, huge game. Because of that special cartridge, this thing would actually, this netted $100 a game. As to where the average game at the time was $50 to $60. This one would retail at $99. It is a massive RPG. It is a beautiful RPG. The translation is a bit better for this than it was for some of the previous Phantasy Star games from Japanese into English. I think it's just a stunning science fiction classic. I mean, well worth, how you want to label, let's just say fantasy classic. How about that? Okay. But however you want to label these. But I think it's a stunning fucking game. And definitely the biggest and most complex of the Phantasy Star series. A lot of people want to say like Phantasy Star 2 is the best. But no, I think Phantasy Star 4 takes it all the way, just on its scope. And I had never played anything at the time at this scale. You know, even on none of the PC games I had really went at this scale, except for maybe like Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Those kinds of games were big. But this just felt so huge. And it was, and you had to pay a premium for it. Phantasy Star 4, if you've never played it, it is worthwhile playing. Now, if you don't want to just like buy a Genesis version of it, I have said many times, the best gaming console you can get today is a soft modded PlayStation 2. Now, if it's soft modded, you can play some Japanese imports of games. And maybe you could actually end up, downloading some disc images of Phantasy Star, games that you could play on a soft modded PlayStation 2. In Japan, there was a re-release, I think this is 98, of the entire Phantasy Star series up until that point. This is before Phantasy Star Online and all these things were a thing. And it was called the Phantasy Star Collection. And the version for the PS2 is amazing. Comes with so much bonus content. And you can very easily convert everything because it's meant to be a collection and all-inclusive. You can convert almost everything from Japanese to English. So this is really the premier way to play these games. Phantasy Star 4 included. The Phantasy Star collection was also re-released for the Game Boy Advance, but for some fucking reason they didn't put Phantasy Star 4 on there. And so, you can't even play the best game in the series. So why the hell would you do that? This has been re-released on mobile phones, on smartphones as well, iOS and Android. I've checked that out, and I think there are some problems. This is a game where you want every bit of screen real estate. You don't really need precise controls, but you want all the screen real estate. You want it to be as pure a product as possible, because this is such a beautiful game at its scale. So I think the best way to play this is the gorgeous collection that came out for PS2 in Japan. And again, that being the Phantasy Star collection, which is part of the original Sega Ages 2500 series over there back in the 90s. So if you can get your hands on that, great. Otherwise, if you can play it on, an emulator, or if you can, however you want to rock it, play it. Phantasy Star 4 is worth it, especially if you're like a Final Fantasy fan or a Dragon Quest fan. This is your stuff. I mean, you're really in for a great time. So, okay, let's move on from that, which, again, so interestingly, like Phantasy Star 4 came out in 93 in Japan, wouldn't come out to the rest of the world until 1995. One of the much later entries, in the Genesis's, lifetime, but well worth it. Well worth it. And speaking of 1995, a game that I thought would have saved the console, because I still think this game is so brilliant. In fact, this game, and we're now at number 3, this game is so ingenious. It actually won a patent for its design. Like for the game design, not the cartridge design, the game design. Sega won a patent on it. Now, I'm an anarchist. Fuck IP laws. Fuck IP. But that's a pretty impressive achievement, okay? And the game we're talking about is one that I talk about often, and that's Comix Zone, okay? Comix Zone is you're playing this character that is a comic book artist, and you basically, kind of like Tron, how Kevin Flynn gets transported into the computer, you get transported into the comic book by the villain of the comic book. It's an ingenious idea. Not the first time it's been done, but it's so fully realized that you are playing within a comic book. You literally have to tear through the pages, like through the middle of the page to get to the next comic book panel. You are playing the game comic book panel by panel, and you can see the other panels on the screen, or you can see some of them as you progress. It's really, really an ingenious game design. It's never been replicated. And it's amazing because, again, Sega owns the patent on making a game like this, which is probably why no one else has ever made a game like this. But why Sega's never bothered to go back and do, Comix Zone 2, 3, 4, 5. I don't understand. I don't know what the fuck they're thinking. This is the only other thing I could think comparable would be like Battletoads. Like, why is nobody, and I know Microsoft wanted to, apparently that's disappeared. Why has nobody made more Battletoads games? These games have such brilliant and iconic design to them. Man, what a waste. But this isn't the first time that a game would emulate being in a comic book in that comic book style. Actually, there was a Batman game which came out in 1988 for the Commodore 64 called Batman the Caped Crusader that did that first. But Comix Zone absolutely did it best and took it to a whole other level. Again, where you see that you're fighting panel through panel. It's really such a beautiful, ingenious design. And in fact, there's no reason to even update the graphics, because you want to just make it look like a comic book. Unless you want to do cell shading or something like that, I could kind of see that. But Sega outdid themselves with this one. It's a hard as fuck game. Does not really have a continue system that works very well. I mean, there's problems there, but it's just so brilliant, so ingenious. And if you're a comic book fan, I mean, it's the first game. I think this is the game where I was really like, man, the Genesis can do some amazing shit. Like, this is the one that really got me on that train. I mean, Echo the Dolphin certainly sold me on it, but this is one where I was like, boy, they're doing things Nintendo's not even dreaming of. And sadly, though, it was so late in the system's life. If we could add Comix Zone 2 and 3 on the Genesis, I think history might be a little bit different. or if they just fucking released it for the Dreamcast. I don't know. I don't get it. I don't understand why Sega hasn't jumped on this train. Maybe if you know, go ahead and email me, bbs@sovereigntech.com. So, okay, let's go on to number 2 on this list. And this is X-Men, a game that I would be impressed. So far, every game we've listed, except for Michael Jackson's Moonwalker, is going to be on the Genesis Mini. If this game could be on the Genesis Mini, I would be really, really impressed. Another game, hard as fuck. It's a platformer. It's X-Men, okay? 1993's X-Men. This wildly successful game, at the time, you had the X-Men cartoon. X-Men, in the comic books, you were doing Age of Apocalypse. X-Men was white hot. And for them to have a great video game as well as a great cartoon and comic running at that time is a masterstroke for any franchise. It really is. You had a few different characters you could choose from. Obviously, everybody just started off with Wolverine. But this is a pretty interesting game for a few reasons. One is it's one of the first games I can remember that broke the fourth wall, well before Metal Gear Solid did. Well before, what was another one? Eternal Darkness, right, for GameCube. So the whole game takes place in the Danger Room where Magneto is like taking over the computer that controls it and everything. And eventually, as you go through the game, you get to the point and you can choose different X-Men, and as one dies, you can play the other. But it's a very basic platformer, and it being in the Danger Room, which is like the X-Men's training room, was a really cool way to explain why you could be in so many different areas. Like, one level is very wooded, it's like a forest, and then another level is like on a station. And it's a great way of explaining that, because the Danger Room is like a holographic. It's literally just like the holodeck on Star Trek. So anyway, when you get to the end of the game and you're going to be defeating Magneto and all this, you actually, a pop-up will come up and you have to reboot the computer, and it tells you have to reset the computer. And now what it's referencing, in the game is it's referencing the Danger Room computer to regain control of it. But the meta of what it's saying is that you need to reset the Genesis. Literally, you have to very quickly flick the reset button on the Sega Genesis. This was insane. Now, here's the rub with this. In fact, I don't know if anybody's talked about what is whatever the Sega system from Analog, the guys that made the Super NT, it was the Sega MG or whatever that they came out with. I wonder if this can do this, because future re-releases of Genesis hardware or Genesis emulation hardware wouldn't be able to pull this off. This is a very real problem. And one of the reasons I'd love to see this get re-released on the Genesis Mini, but then I don't know if the Genesis Mini would be able to pull this off, right? Because the Nintendo microconsoles, those buttons didn't exactly work as they did on the actual, say, Super Nintendo in its day, right? They had different functions. The reset button doesn't, or kind of works in a different way. Because if you bought the Sega Nomad, which was just a portable Genesis, you basically could never beat X-Men if you had the cartridge. You were screwed. So this is really, really interesting to see how this would play on any other hardware than an actual Genesis or Mega Drive. But I remember playing this, and when I got to that and it said to reset the computer, I'm like, wait, what? I mean, it totally fucked with your head. I remember I had to read GamePro to find out what to actually do at the time. But that was so cool for them to break the fourth wall and actually cause you to, they're talking to you and you had to do something in reality, not just press buttons on the controller. You had to reset your computer, your Genesis, but just lightly. You had to be very light about it. You couldn't just power on, power off. You couldn't do that kind of shit. You had to very lightly hit the reset. Brilliant game design, but something that fucked a lot of emulation efforts and re-release efforts, honestly, after the fact. This game was incredibly popular. Even though it was so fucking hard, and the reviews were a little unkind to it, in my opinion, it sold gangbusters because, again, X-Men was the hot thing at the time. You'd end up with a sequel in 1995, which was X-Men 2, The Clone Wars, another very solid game. Not as good as X-Men, I think, but it's solid. Sadly, because the Genesis would end up getting superseded by the Saturn very quickly, And Sega would fall to the same unfortunate mentality that they thought they needed to create a competing, because again, remember, like I told you at the beginning, the Genesis was not competing with the Super Nintendo. It was competing with the Nintendo, with the NES, with the NES. Sega thought we need to create a competitor for the Super Nintendo, and so they came out with the Sega Saturn. That would be their undoing, because then other systems would come out that would blow away what the Saturn could do, and the Saturn wasn't really designed to compete with them. Okay? There's a whole bunch of problems with the Saturn. But anyway, unfortunately, because the Saturn came into the game, pun intended, so soon, there was going to be a third game in the X-Men series on Genesis, and I would have loved to have had this game, because uniquely, the title of the game, and it was going to come out in 97, the title of the game was X-Women. And it was going to be a X-Men game, just like X-Men 1 and X-Men 2, but it was only female members of X-Men, which is fine, because they're the best characters in the fucking series anyway. You know, give me Psylocke, Rogue, Storm, go down the list of them. I think that'd be, that would have been a phenomenal game. And really, I mean, I think in 97, honestly, that would have been a bold move, because that's a very feminist thing to do. I would have loved it. In 97 especially, I think that would have been so great. It would have been so hot to do. So yeah, it's a shame that game never got made. But that, this series was so popular that, it could have been a full trilogy. I really wish it was. I would have loved to have played X-Women in 97. But anyway, that's history. That's how it goes. But X-Men, 93's X-Men, very unique game. And I think a great platformer. Hard, sure, but, who wants to live forever? I mean, nobody said video games have to be easy or accessible. Fuck. They can be hard as hell. Mega Man 9, Mega Man 10, thank you. But anyway, check out X-Men if you've never played that one. But unfortunately, unless you're playing it on very specific hardware, you're not going to beat it. So, okay, let's go to number 1. And this is, I would agree that I would definitely say this is my favorite Genesis game of all time. And that is 93's Jurassic Park. Became a very popular game, largely due to the success of the movie Jurassic Park. There would be a re-release of this game actually about a year later called Jurassic Park Rampage Edition, which I actually think is kind of inferior, even though it's really somewhat of a remake or an expansion of sorts. But I think the original stands tall. And this game is so brilliantly atmospheric. But let me tell you, there's 2 modes. You can play as the human. You can play as Dr. Alan Grant and just go around and shoot things and, play a platformer as such. Which, whatever. I mean, it's the atmosphere in this game is very well done. The music is implemented nicely. Very, very atmospheric. You feel like you're going through, a jungle and all this different stuff. It really, really works on that level. Graphics, in my opinion, are very, very slick, very tight for especially for 1993 and for the Sega Genesis. That would have been an okay game on its own. And it's not, and it would have been one of the better movie tie-in games, really, in gaming history, just with that. But whatever anyone was thinking, at the development team for this game, they had a brilliant idea. They said, let's create a second game mode where instead of playing as the human, you play as the Velociraptor. Fuck, man. And that's when this game goes from a 5 to an easy 10. Because when you're playing the Velociraptor and you're just, like you're Lord of the Jungle, man. I mean, and you're, and you're going through this beautifully done atmosphere, and the music's great. Sound effects are awesome. And you're a dinosaur. That was cool. Much like how, the atmosphere and the music and the gameplay style and everything felt so true with Echo the Dolphin. Like you really felt like you were controlling a dolphin. You really felt like you were controlling a Velociraptor, and the platforming aspect of it suddenly made a lot more sense because we knew, if you watch the movie, just how intelligent and how agile Velociraptors are. And so it just fit. And I thought that was in 93, playing the villain or playing a villain character or playing an animal or something like that, very commonplace today. In 93, almost unheard of. Almost unheard of. And it makes this game stand out really tall. If this were on the Genesis Mini, just to support this game, I might, if we find out in the final 10 games that are going to get announced for the Genesis Mini, if this game, especially if this game and X-Men were on there, you might get me to buy that shit. I mean, because then you have a really solid package, as far as that goes, with some very unique and groundbreaking games. Again, I think the Velociraptor aspect of Jurassic Park is one of the most groundbreaking modes, one of the most groundbreaking moments in video game history. I mean, people just don't think about it, because the Velociraptor, they were not really the good guys in Jurassic Park. They're very much what's chasing the humans. Even, I mean, the T-Rex is more of a good guy, and later on in the Jurassic Park movie series literally would be. But the Velociraptors are always kind of the villain. I love the Velociraptor. I mean, like, I can look to my right and I see my Indoraptor kind of hanging. It's so cool. Anyway, I love those. And to be able to play them in a video game, to this day, it still stands strong. It's still very playable, very replayable. I think it's brilliant. I thought it was such a brilliant move. And I remember actually in 93 going to Toys R Us, and Toys R Us at the time, look at pictures. I want you to do something, okay? Whatever image search you go to, go there and type in like Toys R Us 90s, maybe even like 90s video game displays. The opulence that you see inside of Toys R Us, you can't believe that I mean, if you look at it and then you go to any brick and mortar store today, it's so hard to believe that a place like that existed. Everything looked wildly futuristic. There was just games fucking everywhere. It was crazy. It was such a wild time. So, but they'd always have displays where you could test out the games and everything. And this is one of the games that was out in 93 that was on display for you to try out on the Genesis. And I remember going to Toys R Us or TRU, as we would say, going to TRU and putting this on and seeing, wait, choose what? Mode 2, Velociraptor? Like, you got to be kidding me. And I remember selecting that, and just little 12-year-old me. Of course, I wasn't so little. But anyway, 12-year-old me almost crapped his pants when I was playing the Velociraptor. Like, holy shit. So, and that sticks with me to this day. So I put this at my number one. Little bit of a deeper cut of a game compared to the rest of this. Some of this might have been predictable and would be on other people's. I don't think most people would choose Jurassic Park in their top 10 or top 8 or whatever. But I think it's I really, just for the Velociraptor mode alone, it is a groundbreaking game. So try it out if you never have. Anyway, there's your top 8. So we got Michael Jackson's Moonwalker, Echo the Dolphin, Streets of Rage 2, Mega Man, The Wily Wars, Phantasy Star 4, Comic Zone, 1993's X-Men, and Jurassic Park. Just a brilliant set of games, and you're going to have a lot of fun with any of these. So there's my top 8 list. I appreciate the patron, the member of the Zomia ONE Underground, that requested this top 8. You've got it here for you. I apologize for my voice, but we're getting closer to the end of the month of May 2019. I want to make sure you're getting plenty of content and getting plenty of stuff. So I powered through, and here you go. And hopefully you can understand me and everything that I said. I listened back. I did some pre-recording. It sounded okay. So, but my voice will be back to full strength very soon, and we'll get out some more Sovryn Tech and a whole lot of other content. I will see all of you on the other side.